Hi everyone. I think we might kick off. I know we're expecting a few more people, but we'll just let them join while we're doing the introductions. I know your time is precious and it is 6:30. So welcome everyone. My name is Bidda Jones. I'm a Director of Strategy and one of the co-founders of the Australian Alliance for Animals. And I'll be helping to present this webinar with Greg Sadler from Good Ancestors Project. Greg, I might flip over to you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Peter. So, for people who haven't met me, I'm Greg Sadler. So, I'm on the board of a charity called Effective Altruism Australia, where we work on global health and poverty issues like delivering bed nets to people in sub-Saharan Africa. And I also run a charity called Good Ancestors, where we want to be good ancestors to future generations, which means we work on a really broad variety of projects from like pandemic prevention to safe and responsible AI, nuclear risk reduction. And I guess Bidda and I are working together on this because it's sort of one of those areas where we share really similar values, and the sort of calls that our different communities have been making are quite similar. So by working together, we can kind of have a louder voice in this process.
Absolutely, yeah. So Greg and I started working together on this project when the Productivity Commission started its review, its inquiry, and we helped in terms of putting together a number of different submissions from under the umbrella of charities for impact, and also within the animal sector. The Alliance for Animals led the development of a joint submission that represented the views of 7 different charities in the animal protection sector. So for those of you that don't know about the Australian Alliance for Animals, we're a newish, 2 years nearly, national charity. We lead an alliance of Australia's key animal protection organisations, and our purpose is to create systemic change for animals. And just to be clear, we are one of the charities who would benefit significantly from reform of the laws around philanthropic giving in Australia, because we don't currently qualify for tax deductibility or DGR status under the current arrangements, and nor do several of our member organisations. So we do have a vested interest in changing the way the current structure works. I might just flip back to Greg. Actually, no, before I do that, I'll just acknowledge that Greg and I are speaking to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. And I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of these lands and all the lands we're meeting on today, and to recognise the enduring connections of First Nations people to their land, sea and community. Over to you, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thank you for doing the acknowledgement, and good to see everyone on the line. So just as a housekeeping point, as we work through the presentation, you're welcome to open the chat and ask any questions that you have in there, and whichever one of us, Bidda or I, is not talking, can help read those out. Otherwise, sort of as we get to kind of like the 3/4 mark, we'll stop for questions and we can ask them out loud if that's your preference. So I guess the first question is, what are we doing today? Why are we here? So on this right-hand side, you can see the website for the Productivity Commission and the review that they're doing into philanthropy in Australia. So the idea of this workshop is, by the end of it, you're going to understand a bit about the inquiry that it's doing and what outcomes it's seeking and why that work is happening. And you're going to understand the key points that we'd like you to include in your submission. So you'll hear from us like making these arguments about why we think these ideas are important, and you can agree or disagree in part or in all with those arguments as we make them. We'll help you to craft your own response to the Productivity Commission's inquiry with help from this new AI online tool that we're using for the first time tonight. So the idea of this online tool is that it's completely user-friendly and approachable and doesn't require any sort of skills to use, but it will sort of help you get through that kind of like first 70% of the submission writing process with reduced time and effort, and then you can put your sort of time and effort in where it can be most impactful in shaping your submission. And then the goal is that you can either make a submission during this call or have a clear plan to make that submission by the 9 February deadline. So how did we get here? So it's been a bit of a journey to find itself at this point. So a bit of history, I think, is helpful. So going all the way back to before the last election, the incoming government had made this election commitment to double philanthropic giving. So philanthropic giving in Australia is actually remarkably limited. I think we donate about half as much as what Kiwis do and about a third as much as what people in the United States do. So it's like really remarkable how little philanthropic giving happens in Australia. And so it kind of makes sense that government is working to double that amount of giving. So to actually like deliver on that commitment, government has made this referral to the Productivity Commission to ask how to achieve, like how to deliver upon that commitment. So for people who don't know, the Productivity Commission is this sort of independent research and advisory body that is run by the Australian government that focuses on a range of issues. So, I mean, I've kind of liked the Productivity Commission as a stakeholder because I guess like me, they're kind of nerds, they're interested in the data and they're interested in the facts. So it's not a highly politicized organization, it's an analytical organization. So as Bidda said, we talked to the Productivity Commission in the lead up to this draft report being published. So it's now published that draft report and it sought further feedback before finalizing the report. So what are the arguments that we had made to government? So, I mean, I might throw to Bidda to talk about this first ask that we had.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So under the current system, you can exist as an ACNC registered charity with the purpose of preventing the suffering of animals. You can also be a charity that advocates for changes in the law or changes in policy or practice to prevent the suffering of animals, but you can still not be eligible for DGR status because under the Income Tax Act, the only animal protection charities that are actually eligible for DGR status are those that provide direct care for animals, generally animals that have been lost, mistreated, or without an owner. So we're talking dogs and cats, or rehabilitating animals that are orphaned, sick, or injured, and then we're talking about wildlife. So the only other way you can be eligible and be an animal charity is if you're actually directly named in the Income Tax Act. So the organisation I used to work for, RSPC Australia, is one of those. Or you can apply through the Environment Register and you would be eligible because you do work to protect the environment, and that includes wildlife. So that means that there's a whole lot of animal charities that don't currently sit under this DGR status, including the Alliance for Animals, a number of our members, such as Animals Australia, Voiceless, and Four Paws Australia, and a whole range of other animal charities that don't currently attract this status.
Yeah, thanks, Bidda. And similarly, we asked that this tax-deductible status, this DGR status, be expanded to charities working to tackle catastrophic and existential risks. So an example we gave of this during the first round of consultation was ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. So this is the charity that led the ban treaty and received a Nobel Prize for their work, an Australian charity. But they didn't previously have this DGR status, and the legislation doesn't grant it to them. And they've actually just gone through the process of getting a specific listing, like similar to the RSPCA, which is great. But I guess our view is that you shouldn't have to win a Nobel Prize before you can get your specific listing. And all charities working to tackle these kinds of risks should have the status just in the legislation. A similar point is charities that are using policy advocacy as their primary tool. So currently, that's not seen as a valid way of obtaining DGR status, but that's something that we think is a valid way of achieving impact and change. A second thing we had called for was this idea of public benevolent institutions. So these are charities that work on global health and poverty. So Effective Altruism Australia, where we try and combat things like malaria, is a public benevolent institution. But public benevolent institution currently isn't defined in the legislation, like it's defined by case law. And it's sort of subject to all of these strange quirks that have developed over hundreds of years of case law. And like one of those quirks is that we're confined to only work on global health and poverty. And it's sort of extremely restrictive if we try and dabble in other causes. So when Effective Altruism Australia wants to run like a reading group on animal welfare or something, like we jeopardize our charitable status by doing that. So it's sort of this bizarre restriction that we can't do the same thing many other charities can do just because we have this common law framework that regulates us. Another idea is that we think government should be involved in helping and encouraging for-purpose organisations in Australia to care about impact and to sort of focus on the impact that they can achieve. So there was a terms of reference specifically about this idea of impact, and we think that having a culture of impact makes a massive difference to how much good the sector can do. So on those same metrics, what did the draft report say? So really, this is a good news story. So on this first question about preventing animal suffering, the draft report says, yes, that sounds like a good idea. We buy the arguments that Bidda and others have made, which is great. And they also said that about tackling catastrophic and existential risks. They think DGR should be expanded in this way, and also that policy advocacy is a valid way of achieving these and other charitable goals. So really, this was our main ask, and it was a clean sweep. So that's terrific. Very happy with that. The second question about public benevolent institutions, it's a bit more technical, but again, the Productivity Commission understood it, and this was a tick that they would make this change. So that's terrific for Effective Altruism Australia and other PBIs. Unfortunately, government didn't quite buy into our arguments on impact culture, and I'll talk a bit more about that later in the presentation. But I guess overall, this is just a tremendous outcome in the draft report, I think. Change is hard to achieve and everything moves slowly, and it's easy to forget to celebrate your successes. So I think when the draft report dropped, Peter and I ran down for a coffee together at the cafe and talked about how great it is that the draft report says many things we asked for. So a big thanks to everyone who contributed that first stage, and everyone who can kind of keep the momentum going. It really is a terrific draft report from our perspective. So that kind of asks the question of what's next, right? We have this draft report, but a draft report doesn't a law make. So how do we actually get from this really positive start to actual impact in the world? So the PC is currently accepting comments on this draft report. That's the process we're doing at the moment, and they close on 9 February. And then it will finalize by 11 May its report, and hopefully publish it to the public shortly after it's handed it to government. We'd expect that government will make some kind of public response to that final report in the weeks or months after it's received it. So that'll tend to look like government saying, we agree with these parts, but maybe we don't agree with those parts. And maybe Bidda and I will take that chance to talk to Andrew Lee or others in government to sort of advocate that government agree the parts of the report that we like. Actually implementing the report, these changes, many of them will require legislative change, particularly these changes to tax-deductible status. So it could be that legislation is introduced to Parliament before the election, or maybe it's a sort of a thing for the next Parliament to work on. So there's still a little bit of water to go under the bridge here. But I guess that raises the question, what can we do now? So this presentation, we really want to talk about 4 key points that we think it's really important to raise with the Productivity Commission now. And we hope to persuade you of some or all of these arguments as we talk through them. We're happy to take questions on them. So the first thing is to show support for the recommendations we like. So I think it's a chance. I spent 15 years as a public servant, and it was very rare that someone said you did a good job. Everyone's always got a problem. So I think it's nice. It's compassionate to say, hey, thanks for the work that you've done here. We really like some of these recommendations, and we're happy that you've accepted these arguments. I think it's a good thing to do. So the second idea is that there's ways that we can help make the final report better by suggesting a few clarifications. So the issue here is that, although some of the arguments are good, maybe there's some gaps or some omissions or some detail that we think could make those arguments stronger. The third way is by preempting counter arguments. So some of these changes could be controversial, or they could affect kind of interest groups, and they might make arguments that these recommendations shouldn't be proceeded with. And we think that if the final report says some people may argue this, but those arguments aren't strong for the following reasons, that will make it kind of easier for us to push this report through to implementation. And then my hobby horse, the fourth one, which is we made this argument about impact culture, which the government didn't buy, or the Productivity Commission didn't buy, but I think there's good arguments that the Productivity Commission has sort of misread the terms of reference and the evidence. And so we want to make those arguments as well. So on issue 1, showing support for the recommendations we like. Did you want to talk a little bit more about this sort of first point, Bidda?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I think some of the things that we would be able to raise in terms of the way in which DGR helps for charities such as the Alliance for Animals and the others that I've mentioned. Obviously, it's going to help with fundraising. One of the things that it's worth us pointing out in the report itself, it talks about how, on average, charities in Australia get around 50% of their funding from government, and that's all charities. So that's the average. Animal protection charities are not like that. So the vast majority of animal protection charities get no money from government. So DGR for those preventative animal welfare charities is even more important, because donations from the public make up a much larger proportion of their income than other charities. That's a really important point for us to make. And we can also talk about the different types of activities that this would help fundraise for. So things like animal rescue missions in other countries, engaging other stakeholders to advise them on best practice animal welfare, tackling legalized cruelty in animal systems in Australia to make them align better with modern day expectations and standards, things like disaster and crisis emergency response for animals. There's a whole list of different activities that this would help enable.
Thanks, Bidda. And I guess the same argument applies to, or similar arguments apply to preventing existential and catastrophic risks. Essentially, that there's these sort of large risks to humanity, to future generations, which are often neglected by the current political processes, which tend to be focused on the things that might happen tomorrow rather than the things that might happen over the next 5 or 10 years. I think it was funny when at the start of COVID, when there was sort of this talking point that pandemics are unprecedented, whereas I think anyone who's read a history book knows that pandemics happen regularly, and I think government was feigning surprise, whereas if you had more charities working on preventing these catastrophic risks, they might not be able to use that kind of excuse. So the second point here is to try and make the final report better. So one of these points is about PIJ, which I might let Bidda handle as well.
Yeah, so public interest journalism, it is supported in the draft report. It says that, I know, public interest journalism should become part of the DGR net, if you like, but it doesn't talk about why. And we think that it's really important that the Productivity Commission addresses this in the final report, because if they don't explain really what the clear benefits of public interest journalism, I'll call it PIJ because it's a mouthful. If they don't explain why this is such an important thing, then it's easy for people to dismiss it, and it may not make it through to the final recommendations and become part of the legislation that arises from this inquiry. So we think that PIJ is a really vital aspect of a good democracy. It's important for accountability and transparency. It helps make institutions accountable. It helps shine a light on important and often neglected issues. The plight of animals in Australian society is one of those. So there are so many aspects of animal protection that rely on public interest journalism to expose them to the public, that it's a really important part of the work that the animal protection sector does as well. So yeah, we think the report really should be stronger in terms of explaining why this is an important argument. We think that should be in the submissions that we generate.
Yeah, I think that makes really good sense to me. It's as if they've been persuaded by the arguments presented in the submissions they received, but then just have forgot to kind of translate those arguments into the report. So I think it's a very helpful nudge to provide. A second point here is that this idea of they discuss extending this tax deductible status to catastrophic risk charities, but they kind of link it to advocacy rather than other kinds of ways of tackling catastrophic risks like direct action or research or something. So again, this is a fairly minor clarification that they should just make sure that when they talk about catastrophic risk, they talk about it slightly more broadly. But I think it's an important thing to capture. And then there's this idea that DGR for policy advocacy should extend to policy development as well, because it would be a strange world if you could have tax deductible status for arguing in favor of a policy, but not in doing the rigor necessary to make that policy actually good. This might be a good chance to tackle a question from Sam in the chat, So Sam has asked, is there a risk that harmful charities might be facilitated by making policy advocacy charities tax deductible, e.g. coal lobby charities? So I think that this is a real concern, right? This potentially opens the gateway to kind of like weirder charities and potentially charities that argue for things that are bad. So I guess like one of the reasons, like one of the things that gave me great comfort, or I mean, maybe two things that give me great comfort on this point is firstly, industry can typically, I don't want to give you tax advice in this call, but industry can typically, like for-profit industries can typically already tax deduct advocacy and lobbying activities. So the for-profit industries that can benefit from harm already have tax incentives to engage with government, whereas the not-for-profits that have alternative views don't have that tax benefit. So currently we have a non-level playing field that benefits profit-making industry, but not charities. And I guess the second point is when you go through the ACNC register, there are a bunch of like coal lobby charities, as Sam has said in the chat, that already have this status because they've hired like very smart lawyers to argue that they're really a research institution or whatever it is to sort of navigate the gateways. And I think that Bidda's probably aware of examples in the animal space as well, where charities have with maybe different views to us, have kind of like managed to navigate their way to these DGR statuses by making arguments to the regulator that we can't afford the fancy lawyers to make, or maybe have too much integrity to twist the system in that way. So I think that currently, like the point to answer Sam's question directly is like currently the playing field is slanted in one direction. And so really they already have the leg up. There's a question from Scott in the chat as well about public interest journalism. Asking what public interest journalism is. Did you want to handle that, Bidda?
Yeah, look, I'm not an expert in the definition of public interest journalism, but in terms of there is no current charitable category. So even under the ACNC, there isn't actually a category for public interest journalism to be registered as a charity. So it's not any non-for-profit journalism. At the moment, public interest journalism really only gets to be a charity if they have another purpose. So they can claim a purpose of education, and only a small proportion of, you could probably argue that there's a lot of public interest journalism out there that is also non-profit because they don't make any money, but it doesn't mean that they would qualify as a charity. They're just not creating a profit. But what needs to happen is they need to create a definition for public interest journalism under the purposes that allow you to register for a charity under the ACNC, and only those charities would then be eligible for DGR. So I don't know if I've quite answered that question, but what I would also do is I'd suggest you have a look at the Public Interest Journalism Association submission. It's on the Productivity Commission website. It's submission number 192. And that's a really good source of information about this area.
Yeah, thanks, Bidda. So the third argument we were talking about is trying to like preempt counter arguments. So I might let Bidda handle this part as well.
Yeah, so this kind of goes to what we've been talking about a little bit in terms of potential bad actors, but we are concerned, of course, that vested interests will try and oppose the change. There are many organisations that would argue very strongly against some of our members or the Alliance itself getting DGR status, because it would make us stronger in terms of the things that we can do. So we really want the Productivity Commission to think about this, to think about the potential for vested interest to argue against the changes, and to make sure that the report is really strong in terms of why it is important to have a balanced playing field in terms of animal protection charities. Probably the strongest argument for this is that we already see significant philanthropic giving to these organisations. An organisation like Animals Australia already receives a significant amount of funding from individual donors who don't get a tax deduction for that. So if you're looking at what people want to give money to, they're already demonstrating that this is important to them, and that's something that they should be really acknowledging in terms of the status.
Yeah, and I think the similar arguments apply to sort of other industries as well. So I've used military industrial complex here, slightly tongue in cheek. But I think the idea is that if you're trying to prevent nuclear war or trying to prevent, other kinds of like great power conflicts or whatever the issue might be, that there's some very large incumbent and well-connected industries who might not like this idea of having charities focused on these issues. So trying to preempt the arguments that may make to make the report more robust is good. A similar point here is, and this is going to be like a little bit technical in charity law for a moment, so I apologize, is that there's this kind of gateways that you have to step through. So the first gateway is that you have to be a charity and you have to have like charitable purposes. And then there's like a negative gateway where you, like, even if you do have charitable purposes, you can't be a charity if you do something that is disqualifying or you act in a way that is contrary to public policy. And then if you do have a public purpose, you don't do any of these things that are bad, then you might meet the DGR statuses that we've been talking about. And so expanding that to get tax-deductible status is good. So what we're worried about here, and it's again a bit technical on a legal front, but what we're worried about, these ideas of disqualifying purpose and contrary to public policy, there's been like some case law around them, but they're not well litigated because there's kind of no reason to be, because the people who would trip over on these barriers tend to trip over on the DGR hurdle as well. So they don't become large charities that create court cases. So our worry is that if animal charities or other charities get DGR status, there might be more arguments to say like, okay, like maybe you have DGR status, but we want to argue that opposing animal agriculture is actually contrary to public policy, or saying that Australia shouldn't go to war is a disqualifying purpose because you're interfering with the constitution, or like whatever the arguments might be. So these two concepts might become much more contested if these DGR recommendations are to be accepted. So we think that the Productivity Commission report should just have an extended discussion about these two concepts and what their boundaries are and how they react to policy advocacy and expanded DGR status. And then I guess like this final idea, which is related, is that having more, and it kind of goes to the point that Sam was asking in the chat, is that having more of these policy advocacy charities operating is going to result in some potentially uncomfortable tensions and boundaries. And so just having more discussion about like where those lines are so that we don't have people in parliament saying like, oh, this is uncertain, it creates doubt, it's risky, you definitely should make this change. Because if the PC has discussed it in detail, that sort of like helps like it hinders the mudslingers, I guess, who sort of cast doubt on things. I just see Heidi's comment in the chat, and I think that is absolutely right. And I mean, maybe it's not something that we can comment about in this forum, but it's not speculative that people will try and make arguments about contrary to public policy. Yeah, okay, so that's point 3. So point 4. So this is my hobby horse, so I'll try not to go on for too long about it, but I'll give you enough of the passion to see why this is important. So terms of reference 3.2 asks, like, a government asks the Productivity Commission about the ability of donors to compare charities based on evidence, and it points at international models like GiveWell. And the Productivity Commission said that they don't like what government has asked them to do. They don't like the idea of impact evaluation for a few arguments. So there's arguments where that mandated standardized measures of effectiveness across all charities would be impractical. The next argument was that most donors don't even care about having an impact. So if the donors don't care, why should anyone else? They argue that the fact that GiveWell and the Life You Save exist mean that donors already have all the information that they need, and government doesn't need to be involved. They argue that most charities don't have the skills necessary to measure the programs they deliver, and that the charities don't want to have to pay the cost of having to collect evidence and do evaluations. And they argue that like government spending in this space doesn't have any value for money for government. So you might yourself think that those sound like pretty bogus reasons, but just to kind of like unpack that, we think there's like a much better position here. So I think that the effective altruist folk in the call would know that average sort of like non-informed people think that like a highly impactful charity might be like 50% better than the average charity, whereas real evidence shows that highly impactful charities, like charities that care about impact evaluation and evidence, can often be 10 or 100 times better, not just 50% better. So there's like a huge differential, like way bigger than any other industry, for people who focus on impact. And this idea of the Productivity Commission dismissing mandated, universal, and standardized as unrealistic is silly, because the terms of commission or terms of reference never asked them to consider this enormously high bar. That's not what the terms of reference said at all. And there's this argument that like maybe it's true that like large numbers of donors and charities don't care about impact, but like the government should care about impact because it wants to get value for money for its sponsorship of the sector, and it wants to achieve public good. But if the charities don't care and the donors don't care, like government should get more involved in that space. And again, there's this idea that the charities lack the skills, which the Productivity Commission concludes is a reason to not require them to do the thing. Whereas to me, it's like quite clear that if you have a skills gap, you should work on addressing the skills gap rather than saying that skills gap is the reason not to do the thing. And again, like going back to that first point, like the benefit from an increased focus on impact and evaluation is so tremendously large that government just spending a small amount of money to address the skills gap or to, sponsor a grants program to sort of bring GIFL to Australia, like maybe this is a few $1 million and it could generate like really enormous amounts of impact. So there's more information on those arguments in the table that we'll get to in a second. So this is probably a good chance to take any questions before we talk about the tool.
No additional questions. We might keep going.
Yeah, okay. So I guess like a super high level view of this next process is we'll take you to Submission Copilot, which can help us very quickly generate a draft submission. And then we can spend a little bit of time working on our draft submissions to make sure that they represent us and their accurate views and they're our voice. And then we can submit them to the Productivity Commission.